Throughout the summer, the lectionary will take us through a cycle of stories telling the saga of David, one of the most complicated figures of the Hebrew Bible. The story so far. The people of Israel asked for a king to be appointed over them. Samuel, the priest and prophet, warns them that a king will disappoint them, but nonetheless, Saul is crowned king. Not too long after, Saul turns out to be a disappointment as a king, as predicted, so Samuel goes in secret to find a replacement who, much to everyone's surprise, turns out to be David, the youngest son of Jesse. Last week, we covered one of his greatest hits, as he brought a new and much more effective strategy into play when conventional warfare wasn't the right tool to win the battle against the Philistines. David wins the Israelites glory and victory that day, but the war with the Philistines continues. The defeat of Goliath was what got David... Mouse keeps jumping. Come on, mouse. Oh, bother. I just changed the battery. Come on, mouse. Where did you even go? Okay. The defeat of Goliath was what got David noticed by King Saul, and is probably the event most people think of when they think of David. But the defeat of Goliath wasn't the most important thing that happened to David that day, and I wanted to share a scene that happens immediately after last week's story, after David has used Goliath's own sword to cut off his head and has presented it to King Saul. A reading from the first book of Samuel, chapter 18, verses 1 through 9. Hear now the word of the Lord. When David had finished speaking to Saul, the soul of his son Jonathan was bound to the soul of David, and Jonathan loved him as his own soul. Saul took him that day and would not let him return to his father's house. Then Jonathan made a covenant with David, because he loved him as his own soul. Jonathan stripped himself of the robe that he was wearing and gave it to David, and his armor, and even his sword and his bow and his belt. David went out and was successful wherever Saul sent him. As a result, Saul set him over the army, and all the people, even the servants of Saul, approved. As they were coming home, when David returned from killing the Philistine, the women came out of all the towns of Israel singing and dancing to meet King Saul, with tambourines, with songs of joy, and with musical instruments. And the women sang to one another as they made merry. Saul has killed his thousands, and David his 10,000s. Saul was very angry, for this saying displeased him. He said, "They have ascribed to David 10,000s, and to me they have ascribed only thousands. What more can he have but my kingdom?" So Saul eyed David from that day on. This is the word of the Lord. David becomes best friends with Jonathan, the son of the king, whom David will someday replace. King Saul had offered the boy his own armor to wear in combat against Goliath, but as soon as David tried it on, he realized it was too heavy to walk in. He couldn't wear it. But then Jonathan gives David his armor, and David takes and wears it happily. They loved each other as their own souls. David goes on to marry Michal, Jonathan's sister and King Saul's daughter. Michal loved David too, although it was pointed out to me this week in a commentary that we are never told that David loved Michal back. Still, David is now deeply enmeshed in the royal family that he knows he has been anointed to replace. Whether King Saul figures out that plan, or whether he just grows to resent David as a public figure who is increasingly more popular than King Saul himself, the king keeps an eye on David, and later tries to have him killed in battle with the Philistines, and even tries to kill him himself. Going against their father, Jonathan warns David about King Saul's plans and intercedes for him, convincing his father to accept David back in the royal court, at least for a time. And Michal, too, saves David's life from her own father by helping him escape, even though David leaves her behind. I imagine it was hard for Jonathan, being torn between David and his father. Even though King Saul wanted David dead and arranged for his death many times, Jonathan never left his father's house, and ultimately died by his side in battle. David and Jonathan loved each other and their people and their God more than any one earthly ruler. But both Saul and Jonathan did die ahead of their times, and I imagine it was heartbreaking for David to lose them both on the same day. On the one hand, Saul had long wanted him dead, and with his death, David now stood to take his throne. But on the other hand, he had lost Jonathan, whom he loved as his own soul. The war with the Philistines is still ongoing, and it is the Philistines who kill Jonathan and two of his brothers. Seeing that they are lost, King Saul and his armor-bearer both die by suicide rather than face a slow death at the hands of their enemies. And so we come to the next part of the story. A reading from the second book of Samuel, chapter 1, verse 1, and 17 through 27. Hear now the word of the Lord. After the death of Saul, when David had returned from defeating the Amalekites, David remained 2 days in Ziklag. David intoned this lamentation over Saul and his son Jonathan. He ordered that the song of hard things be taught to the people of Judah. It is written in the book of Yashar. He said, "Your glory, O Israel, lies slain upon your high places. How the mighty have fallen. Tell it not in Gath. Proclaim it not in the streets of Ashkelon. Or the daughters of the Philistines will rejoice. The daughters of the uncircumcised will exult. You mountains of Gilboa, let there be no dew or rain upon you, nor bounteous fields. For there the shield of the mighty was defiled, the shield of Saul, anointed with oil, no more. From the blood of the slain, from the fat of the mighty, the bow of Jonathan did not turn back, nor the sword of Saul return empty. Saul and Jonathan, beloved and lovely. In life and in death they were not divided. They were swifter than eagles. They were stronger than lions. O daughters of Israel, weep over Saul, who clothed you with crimson in luxury, who put ornaments of gold on your apparel. How the mighty have fallen in the midst of the battle. Jonathan lies slain upon your high places. I am distressed for you, my brother Jonathan. Greatly beloved were you to me. Your love to me was wonderful, passing the love of women. How the mighty have fallen, and the weapons of war perished. This is the word of the Lord. I've admitted before that David is my least favorite character in the Bible, and that hasn't changed so far as we've been going through his story together this summer. But at the same time, David was a poet, and a really good one. And this song of lament is an objectively gorgeous and intimate and moving eulogy. It's one thing to grieve the loss of Jonathan, whom he loved as his own soul. But David also weeps for the loss of King Saul. King Saul had tried to kill David several times and failed. David had had the opportunity to kill Saul several times and chose not to. King Saul stood between David and the throne that he had been anointed to take. But David married his daughter and loved his son. King Saul saw David as a rival, but David still led the king's soldiers into battle to defend the kingdom of Israel. David first comes into the story as a young boy, and I imagine that he would have grown up hearing stories of Saul's military victories, and cheered when such a great man was crowned as king, and rejoiced that the people of Israel could be united into one kingdom under a ruler like that. There was a time when Saul would have been a great hero, and David makes space to grieve that. His best friend had deserved the sort of father who would have been kind and patient and wise. But that wasn't the father Jonathan had, and David makes space to grieve that. His wife, Michal, deserved the sort of father who would have seen her as a person worthy of respect, a father who would have hoped for her happiness, a father who would have trusted her to do the right thing. That wasn't the father Michal had, and David makes space to grieve that. The newborn kingdom of Israel deserved a ruler who looked out for all people, not just the wealthy or the military elite, a ruler who was faithful to God and who heeded the words of prophets, a ruler who planned for a future of peace. That wasn't the king that Israel had, and David makes space to grieve that. Saul was not a good leader in the end, and he wasn't a good father, and he wasn't a good king. But there were moments when he was, and there was a time when he had the people's support, and there were years when his children loved him, and the members of his court looked up to him, and even David wanted to be by his side. Those are the moments and the times and the years that weigh David down with grief and regret and maybe even some guilt. For all his faults, Saul was still a beloved child of God. Even though Saul had failed his people, no death should be celebrated. Despite all my problems with David, this, I think, is his brightest moment. And in this moment, he is still a young and beautiful and good man in the grace of God. He could celebrate the end of his rivalry with Saul and his coming coronation, but he values the love he and Jonathan shared more than that. And I imagine the moment was less sweet without Jonathan at his side. Even more, David is humble enough and generous enough to remember how Saul first stepped into the story, and to wish that Saul hadn't fallen from grace. And most of all, David hears about a crushing military defeat in which even the king himself and 3 of his sons meet their end, and he knows that many other people in the kingdom are now missing brothers and husbands and fathers and friends. There will be a time for celebration, but not yet. First, David weeps and tears his clothes and composes a lament that he calls the Song of Hard Things, and he teaches it to his people. Jonathan's death is a hard thing and deserves to be mourned. The death tolls of this most recent battle are a hard thing and deserve to be mourned. Even the death of a king who had fallen from grace is a hard thing and deserves to be mourned. The war isn't over yet, and so there will be more hard things to come. Hard things need to be named, not covered over. Joy may come in the morning, as David would later write in his book of Psalms. But first, there is a night of weeping.